today. So the first thing I want to talk about is the background of what was going on and still is going on in the world of the railroad and railroad labor in recent years. So many of you maybe followed our master contract freight agreement fight in the summer and fall of 2022. It culminated with a back to work legislation under the Railway Labor Act. We were about to stage the first national rail strike in 32 years, 31 years, I believe. And why did that come about? What brought those conditions to a head? When I hired out 27 years ago, the old heads would tell me you wouldn't mark off because you didn't want to miss the fun. This is what these old Chicago guys off the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, the Erie Lackawanna would tell me. And at that point, things were becoming slightly less fun. And when I say less fun, I mean the work hours were more intense. The demands upon the workforce were more severe. Your ability to mark off without pay, mind you, but your ability to mark off and have a life, maybe go to Florida for a week, etc., was all coming to a close. Discipline was up. The railroad got more and more authoritarian. And this isn't just the railroad, of course. This is industry across the board in auto, steel, and many, many industries. There was an effort to shift the blame from all accidents and injuries, fatalities. Anytime something went wrong, the rail carrier wanted to shift the blame for insurance purposes, etc., onto the workforce. So you were constantly becoming under the microscope, under the gun, subject to discipline, subject to harsh attendance policies. And this, of course, was all driven by Wall Street. The demand for lean production, cut the payroll, increase profits, and make your stock more valuable in Wall Street. So this was the environment that I hired in the 90s. And things continued to degenerate. And it's the reason, of course, I left the Norfolk Southern and came to Amtrak, where I found a less hostile work environment. And I also had more time to do things like this, speak to the Deerfield Progressive Forum, because I wasn't always at work. In the freight industry, you are married to the railroad. Many railroaders are remarried 2 and 3 times, divorced, etc. It's a very, very difficult and demanding life in freight service. Well, things all sort of came to a head back in 2022. The Presidential Emergency Board, and I could spend hours talking about the Railway Labor Act, but it's a Byzantine formation, a piece of legislation that guides us through bargaining. It's different than the National Labor Relations Act. But the Railway Labor Act authorizes the president, in the event of impasse between the union and the carriers, to appoint a PEB. So this was PEB, I believe, number 250. There was 249 previous presidential emergency boards appointed. So PEB 250 met in August. I believe it was either late August, early September. They made their recommendation. This is non-binding, but it carries a huge amount of weight. And the recommendation goes to the carrier and to the union to accept the PEB's recommendation. And what they recommended was a wage increase, but with absolutely no changes in work rules. And what has driven railroaders like myself crazy for the last 2 or 3 decades is everything I just talked about: the discipline, the harassment, the lack of time off, feeling like a complete and total wage slave. And the PEB addressed none of these demands. And so what it all boiled down to was a few days of sick time. Most railroaders have never had paid sick leave. This blows people's minds when I tell them. They say, "Don't you have a union?" I say, "Yeah, we're the most unionized sector of the economy." But most of us have never had sick time. And there was a good reason for that, because you could mark off, there was only two states of affairs in the railroad. You're marked up or you're marked off, especially in train and engine service. If you marked off, there was no penalty. You didn't get paid, but you could go to Florida. You could take a trip around the world. You could get your personal affairs in order, deal with family crises and emergencies. There was really no attendance policy when I started with the railroad. So this was a great benefit. You worked as much as you wanted when you wanted to, and you laid off when you didn't want to work. Well, that all changed. This was not encodified in the union contract, and so we lost it. Really a lack of foresight on the part of the trade unions, because now we were working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and we had to. There was no reprieve. And so this is what the rallying cry became in the fall of 2022 amongst freight railroaders, and of course, those of us in passenger service who were in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in freight. That came on the heels of a whole lot of things, something called precision scheduled railroading. All PSR really is lean production. It's a way for the railroad to cut maintenance, cut inspection, cut the workforce, build incredibly long and heavy trains up to 2, 3, and even 4 miles long, all in the interest of saving on labor costs, and once again, increasing profits and lowering the operating ratio to make Wall Street hedge funds happy. So this is the context of which this battle came to a head. We once had 2 million railroad workers in the United States. We were down to under 200,000. A third of the workforce had been trimmed in the last 4 years. 35,000 or so railroad jobs just disappeared under this regime called precision scheduled railroading. So we're working longer hours. There's more and more restrictions placed on our time off work. The BNSF, big railroad out west, led the charge with an incredible draconian attendance policy that gave no excuses. And so they were pushing people to the absolute limit. The lack of maintenance and inspection of equipment would lead to a huge catastrophe just a few months later in East Palestine, Ohio, that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have followed the tragedy that developed there. And of course, we predicted this is in the cards, and it still is in the cards because the railroad hasn't changed its spots. In this context, it was becoming increasingly difficult for the railroad industry to attract applicants. When I hired in, everybody asked me, how'd you get the job? Who did you know? There was a lot of nepotism. It was generally sons and daughters, nephews, who got jobs on the railroad. You had to know somebody because everybody wanted to work for the railroad, right? We were solidly union, good pay, good benefits, health care, and this thing called the railroad retirement system, under which, like Social Security, but it's like Social Security on steroids. So everybody wanted to work for the railroad. That's different. That's changed now. The railroad is finding it harder and harder to recruit and retain people, especially in the train and engine craft. I've outlined a lot of the reasons why that's the case. In this context, the railroad has also gone on the offensive. All the cuts that I just outlined are not enough. They want to reduce the train crews, which is for the last 30 years usually been 2, an engineer and a conductor on every freight train in this country. They want to reduce that to 1, and they have been pushing endlessly to get that to 1. And they make no bones about the fact that they actually want these trains to run with nobody aboard if and when they can ever figure out a way to do that. So this is, some of the background that led up to us taking the position that we've had enough. We are constantly fighting these rearguard actions against Fortune 500 corporations. There used to be 40 Class 1 railroads back in 1980. Today, there's 6. Between the 6 of them, they have largely monopolized rail transport in the United States. They have incredible power. Eugene Debs, who I referenced earlier, the founder of the American Railway Union, once said, I would rather have a railroad that is run by the people or by the government than a government that is run by the railroads. And for those of you who have read any of the history of the United States railroads, the old robber barons back in the day wielded enormous economic and political power over the government, both at the state, municipal, and at the federal level. And we would maintain that the same thing is true today. The rail industry in this country is not doing its job. Its job, of course, as was legislated as a common carrier, was to handle passengers and freight and serve the needs of the nation, as well as make a profit. But as we know, with a lot of businesses today, all of those ethos of support for the community, paying good wages, taking care of the country's needs is completely out the window. And so what is developed on the railroad is this thing called the cult of the operating ratio, where railroads are hell-bent on reducing their operating ratio to 0.50. Now, what does that mean? The rail industry is saying that for every carload of freight we move, for every dollar we make, we want to make 50 cents profit. So for every dollar we take in gross, we want 50-cent profit net. And this is unheard of in the history of the rail industry and most other industries. To the best of my knowledge, the trucking industry largely operates on a ratio between 0.85 and 0.995. Same with the fast food industry and lots of other industries. So this is quite phenomenal that the rail industry has this expectation that they can make this level of profit. Now, how do you do it? Cuts to labor, cuts to maintenance, cuts to inspection, cuts to customer service. I could go on and on and on about what the state of the railroad industry has become. We're moving 24% less freight than we did in 2006. That's hard to imagine. As the economy has grown by leaps and bounds in the last 17 years, why is the rail industry not moving more freight? It doesn't make sense, but they're making more profit. Well, here's the key. Most businesses have to drum up business to make more profit, not the rail industry, at least not in the short run. They have found the key, which is endlessly cut service, jack up rates, skimp on safety, like I was saying, inspections and maintenance and so forth, build these extremely long trains, which are more prone to breaking down. And when they do break down, they're a bear to fix because now you got 4 miles to walk before you can find the brake, the air hose that's busted, the vent valve that's stuck open, whatever the problem with the train might be. So the train takes a longer delay than it used to. So for so many reasons, the rail industry is providing very poor service, moving way less freight, alienating its entire workforce, alienating every major shipping group that ships by rail in the United States, and yet they're making record profits. So this is the context within which RWU decided in the heat of the battle last fall, or fall 2022, engaged in the contract fight, that we're finally going to come out and say enough is enough. It's time to join the rest of the world and bring our railroad system under public ownership. So let's take a look at the rest of the world. China is off the charts with their not only developing high-speed rail and linking every major city in China with trains going 200 miles an hour plus. These lines are electrified. In many cases, they're double track. And in many cases, brand new gradients. All across Europe, trains are expanding dramatically. Spain has linked every major city in the country with high, or what's called higher speed rail. And they're also developing their freight network. India announced a few years ago their intention to electrify the entire railroad system of India, one of the biggest in the world. All of the main lines will be electrified, and now they're embarking upon generating the electricity through renewable sources. These are dramatic developments the world over in both industrialized and industrializing economies. But yet in the United States, there's no move to double track practically anything. Most of our main lines are single track. The railroads have stated their hostility to electrification.
Yeah,
so as a result, it's not just that railroad workers ourselves are pissed off and angry with the treatment that we're getting. It's not just that we believe we should share in some of those profits. Like Sean Fain from the auto workers just said, it's time for us as auto workers who create the wealth to share in those profits. Of course, we want to be treated well and with respect and dignity. Of course, we don't want to suffer these disciplinary policies and a shrinking workforce, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not just us. The entire nation stands to benefit dramatically from public ownership of the railroad. When an industry is strictly beholden to Wall Street, making short-term profits, it's very hard to do the things that we need, like expanding the physical plant to 2, 3, and even 4 tracks to move hundreds of trains a day over a main line instead of just 20 or 30, to electrify the railroad and to take advantage of what's called regenerative braking. So when trains brake or slow or come down mountains, like right here in my backyard in the Sierra Nevada, they're actually generating electricity with the power of all of that momentum dropping off a 7,000-foot mountain. They're making electricity. We can't do that now with diesel electric locomotives. It's very unfortunate. So these efficiencies, moving freight off the nation's highways, moving planes out of the air, all to the advantage of a cleaner and greener environment, we can't capitalize on. And the proof of that is, like I say, the industry is moving 24% less freight than it did 17 years ago. So let's look at the different groups that would benefit specifically. We've already outlined why we believe railroad workers would benefit. The harsh draconian attendance policies, in theory, would go away. The lack of dignity and respect under a public ownership system, we would have ideally worker participation in the conditions of employment. I would think that public employees would also have paid sick leave. So there's numerous reasons, including safety and health, why we believe a public system would do better by railroad workers. But it will also do better by passenger trains. For 50 years, we've watched Amtrak stumble along and be incapable of expansion and development. Amtrak has succeeded in spite of itself, but it's hamstrung at every turn by the Class I freight railroads, because in this country, different than any other country in the world, basically, the infrastructure is owned and managed privately. So Amtrak is the tenant and pays rent to the host being the big 6 Class I railroads. And those railroads got bigger fish to fry, and that's the freight movement of freight. And so Amtrak trains are delayed at every turn. Having been an Amtrak engineer and run my trains over 6 different Class 1 railroads, I can attest to the fact that most of the delay at Amtrak and some commuter agencies is the result of what they call freight train interference. Now, interestingly, we used to have very, very busy main lines in this country with both freight and passenger, and the trains actually did run on time. So the freight industry has been Amtrak's nemesis. Not only do they not run the existing trains on time, they lobby intensely and pull out all the stops whenever Amtrak wants to put on an additional frequency in a busy corridor. For example, from Harrisburg or Pittsburgh to Harrisburg to Philly to New York. There's only one train. The assumption is that that corridor could handle 2, 3, 4 trains a day. But the rail industry digs in its heels, screams bloody murder, does whatever it can to keep that from becoming a multiple frequency corridor. By the same token, you may be familiar with the fight down in the Gulf, where Amtrak has attempted, for 15 years now, to restore passenger train service, at least on part of that route. It used to go all the way from New Orleans to Jacksonville. Hurricane Katrina washed out the tracks. When CSX put the track back, that was the end of the train, the passenger train. So Amtrak has tried desperately to get it back. They've settled for 2 short trains between Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans. And CSX and Norfolk Southern, who are the host railroads, have been vociferous in their refusal to run these trains because it would interfere with their freight traffic. They're moving 10 trains a day. That's all they're moving, 10 trains a day. Imagine that in 24 hours, only 10 movements. But somehow Amtrak is going to make it impossible without a huge influx of cash, i.e., corporate welfare, to host Amtrak trains. Even though they did host the long distance train, the Sunset Limited, before Hurricane Katrina, now they simply can't. So this is the context within which the advocacy groups, of which I am a member and my organization is a member of both the Rail Passengers Association, RPA, the Rail Users Network, and we have fraternal relations with lots of different advocacy groups around the country, and we are attempting to win them over to the idea that your back is against the wall. You have made very limited progress in the 50 years or so of Amtrak's existence because the freight rail industry is largely a monopoly. It's privately held. And you know as well as we do, they're going to fight you at every turn. So what's the solution? Once again, public ownership of the railroads. So let's look at another group, environmentalists. I would imagine many of you in this room might consider yourselves environmental activists. You would like to see electric cars. You would like to see perhaps the end of coal mining and so forth and so on. Rail is the most efficient means of transportation known to humanity. Steel wheel and a steel rail creates almost no friction. If you look at a comparison between a big rig 18-wheel truck, you got 18 rubber tires going down concrete or asphalt with a huge amount of friction to move one truck. A railroad can handle 200 or 300 boxes, trailers, containers in one train with almost no friction. So the economies of rail supersede waterway, airline, and highway already. In addition, it's very easy comparatively to electrify a railroad. And of course, that electricity, like we see in India, can be generated by renewables, meaning zero carbon emissions. And just a note, carbon emission, the biggest source of carbon emissions in this country now is from transportation. It has eclipsed electric power generation as we switch from coal to natural gas. So something's got to be done in the transportation sector, and we would advocate a robust expansion of passenger rail to handle freight and passengers going forward. Once again, Wall Street's not interested, and that's proved by the fact that we continually move less and less and less freight, to say nothing of not expanding our passenger system. I could go on about the pollution from rubber tires, millions of pounds of rubber that is degenerated through the movement of freight and the automobile going into our waterways. Of course, the effect on climate change. We could talk about the upper atmospheric pollution of planes at 40,000 feet, what that does to the upper atmosphere. And we also talk about barge traffic on the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio. It's often overlooked, but it's a huge, huge source of pollution, and it's a major means by which we move bulk commodities around this country. All of that could and should be on the rail, I would maintain, because to have a barge industry, we constantly dredge the river bottoms of all of the nation's great rivers, and that is a terrible ecological destruction of such a great resource. So there's lots and lots and lots of reasons why environmentalists could be, should be, and we believe will be on board with a massive expansion of the railroad system in this country. And as we've talked about endlessly, that will only be able to take place if it's publicly owned, because Wall Street just ain't interested. Let's take a look quick at rural communities, trackside communities, and so forth. Throughout the country, the lifeblood of small town America was once the railroad, and we still have thousands and thousands of small cities and towns that are stretched out along relatively busy main lines across places like Nebraska and North Dakota, Kansas, Eastern Colorado. And these communities once had passenger stations with maybe 2, 3, 4 trains stopping every day. That is largely gone. These communities once had small industries, grain elevators, factories, etc., maybe employing 5, 10, 15, 50 people or so. And they were vital infrastructure for these small communities. Much of that has dried up and gone away. And the rail industry is complicit in that, because the rail industry doesn't want to move 1 boxcar load a week. They're not interested in switching out your plant and taking the time, the labor, and a diesel locomotive to come to your plant, switch it out to only gain a limited amount of revenue. And remember the cult of the operating ratio. Every time you handle a boxcar load or a hopper load of raw material or finished product, if you're not making that target goal of 50 cents on the dollar, it's actually bringing down the operating ratio of the railroad as a whole. So the rail industry has driven away, we would maintain, millions of carloads of freight. And they've been actively doing this for decades. It's gone into an accelerated mode under this scheme I talked about, precision scheduled railroading. So this has been devastating for small town America in terms of economic and social vitality. Down by the depot, it's an old book that I have here on the shelf, and it talks about how it was the focal point of the community. And this is where freight for the local economy, packages, family members, visitors would all be down at the depot. Well, this is gone. We don't even have a bus station at best. A place along the curb where the bus stops once a day now is what we have. So we believe that rural communities and trackside communities like Keys Palestine, for example, would benefit greatly from public ownership, because now the railroad, like the highways, the waterways, would be open as a public service and would be in business not just to make a profit, and a short-term profit at that. They would be in business as a public service to the community, like the library or the park service or so many other wonderful public services that we have or used to have before much of it's been privatized in the last 50 years. So Once again, rural communities, trackside communities, and tribes, Native Americans around the country, many of whom have been historically exploited by the railroad, which was there to assist in basically taking away their land and their property back in the 1800s and early 1900s. Many of those tribes live adjacent to the mainline railroads and could benefit dramatically if the railroad was actually, instead of blasting through their communities and their reservations, was actually there to help serve and build up industry and the economy on the res. Now, last but not least is a group that I generally don't have a whole lot to do with, nor do I know much about them. And they often are extremely powerful, big capitalists themselves, and that's the railroad shippers. So as I mentioned earlier, most major shipping groups in the United States have complained vociferously to the Surface Transportation Board in recent years. The STB is the successor to the old Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC was abolished back in the 90s under the Bill Clinton administration and was succeeded by the Surface Transportation Board. That is a much more stripped down regulatory agency that largely lets the railroads do whatever they want. But these shippers, whether it's coal or oil, whether it be the agricultural industry, the recycling industry, chemical industry, have complained endlessly in front of Congress and to the STB about the rotten service that they are getting from the nation's railroads. At one point, a year and a half, 2 years ago, the railroad was embargoing traffic. They were so tied up, they were so incapable of moving freight with their alienation of the workforce, the inability to hire people and retain conductors and engineers, running these 3-mile-long trains, clogging up the railroad, that things were coming to a near total meltdown. So it wasn't looking good. And so the railroad actually placed embargoes, and they started placing them on not just these small shippers, but even some of their biggest, most powerful, influential shippers, and said, we can't handle the traffic. So the nation's railroads actually said, we don't want your business. In fact, we refuse to take your business. So this is how bad it was getting in the summer of 2022. So many shippers leave the railroad and they ship by truck. They don't want to ship by truck, but that is the alternative. So the railroad basically says, literally, it's our way or the highway. And in many cases, shippers, especially small ones, but even mid-size and larger ones, ship more and more and more of their product on the highway. And that's bad for all of us. But it's especially bad for these shippers. So the point being here, shippers are extremely alienated and would probably do well. Ideologically, they're not necessarily going to be in favor of something like public ownership, because that sort of makes them smart. Ouch, we can't have such a thing as that, because there's solidarity amongst businessmen that, the public sphere is bad. And of course, the magic hand of the marketplace and Adam Smith and free enterprise and all that stuff is good. So they may ideologically be opposed to it, but in fact, we believe it would be in the interest of industry that ships by rail to enjoy a public system that is much more reliable and efficient than to continue to rely on the private railroad system. So let's see, where does that bring us to? Public ownership. So let's talk about it. And we only got about another 10 minutes or so, so I'll start to wind it up here. We actually had public ownership once in this country, very briefly during World War I. Under the Woodrow Wilson administration, it was deemed that the rail industry just simply could not pony up and meet the needs of the war effort and move the nation's freight, passengers, and munitions. So the railroads were taken under public ownership for about 2.5 years. When the war ended, the question was, what are we going to do now? So of course, private industry and the conservatives were like, oh, well, give it back and let the managers, let the rail industry return to the chaotic running of the rail industry. And the rest is history. We know what happened. They won out. But the labor movement and its allies formed a thing called the Plum Plan League. The president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers at the time, my union, was actually the head of the Plum Plan League. And what the Plum Plan said was the railroad industry should remain in public hands, and it should be governed by a tripartite commission of 1/3 railroad worker representatives, 1/3 government representatives to protect the public interest, and 1/3 professional railroad managers. So this idea gained extreme popularity. In fact, the rail unions at the time, there was 16 of them then, polled their membership in a national plebiscite. The vote was about 350,000 railroad workers voting yes, and about 5,000 voting no. About 99% to 1% was the vote. The AFL, the relatively conservative craft union federation at the time, this is 20 years before the CIO, the AFL at its convention overwhelmingly voted for the Plum Plan, not just in rail, but also in steel and energy, i.e. coal mining. So there was a real movement afoot to ditch the corporate model in the commanding heights of industry and turn ownership and control over to workers and the feds. I don't need to tell you, this all failed. There was a bill in front of Congress, I forget the name, it was voted down. And then what followed, interestingly, was the Palmer raids, where 20,000 immigrants, anarchists, socialists, communists were all kicked out of the country. The industrial workers of the world, the industrial union at the time, most of the leadership went to prison, sentenced up to 10 years. And the labor movement was largely busted up through the roaring 20s and would not really reemerge again until after the crash of the stock market, the Great Depression, and the formation of the CIO in the mid-30s. And so that was the last real attempt at public ownership of basic industry in this country. But the reason I bring it up is I believe that something that was that popular 100 years ago could be that popular again today. It is needed more today than it was, I believe, 100 years ago. So how do we get there? RW's launched this campaign, like I say, back during the heat of the battle in October of 2020. So for about a year and a half now, a little bit less, we have been proselytizing and beating the bushes. I did put a bunch of stuff in the chat earlier. And so if anybody wants to go to the chat while I'm talking, and feel free to click on or save any of these links. The first one, the website, Public Rail Now, is going to be relaunched as its own independent website of the coalition of groups sometime in the coming weeks. Right now, it's just on our internal Railroad Workers United website. But you can click on any of these or save them and look at them later. And all of the stuff that's under that first link are just links from that page. So if you save that first link, you actually will have access to all of the rest of this information. So what we did is we put out the call for endorsements. At this point, we only have 50 or 60 organizations. But the labor organizations in support of single-payer healthcare have glommed on because that's their thing, is public ownership. The United Electrical Workers Union that builds locomotives in Erie, Pennsylvania, organizes rail crew van drivers. We've had a lot of contact with them with cross-pollination around rail. They have signed on because they believe it would be in their interest to have public ownership of the railroads, and a huge demand for electric locomotives, which they hopefully would build. Family Farm Defenders, a nationwide farm association of small farmers, has signed on, as has the Labor Network for Sustainability, the Green Party, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And if you go through the list of endorsers, which is on one of those links, I think it's the third one down, you will see and get an idea of the types of organizations. Maybe some of you are members or are aware of these organizations' existence. And so that's one aspect of the campaign, is to get organizations, environmental, labor, community, advocacy, all on board with the campaign. Like I say, we're revamping the website. It'll be extremely attractive and user-friendly. We're paying for this new platform. And we've managed to get a few grants. And so with those grants, we're doing a number of things. A grad student at Brown University who is nothing short of brilliant, has, I suppose, been a rail enthusiast his entire life, is putting together a white paper that will outline much of what I've just talked about and a lot more. And then Haymarket Books in Chicago has offered us to take the white paper and make a book out of it. And so we'll have a book, hopefully in the next year or so, published on the whole question of public rail ownership of the railroads. We are contracting with a woman to do an economic feasibility study to prove that public ownership of the railroad would not only be economically feasible and possible, but talking about all of the benefits of moving freight off the highways, planes out of the sky, and putting passengers and freight back on the rail, revitalizing downtown communities, rural America, and so forth. So this is all the stuff we got going on. We have endless articles. There's a page where you can literally spend all day reading 2 or 3 dozen articles and watching various videos, including myself, other railroad workers and professors expounding on why public ownership of the rails is necessary. And then last but not least, we have a grant to put an organizer in the field full-time. This is a limited duration, but we do hope to achieve further funding because we believe we're going to be very successful, and that grant maker and or other grant makers will look at our success and say, hey, we want to see this continue, and hopefully the organizer can be in the field indefinitely. And of course, the organizer's job is to beat the bushes, proselytize, raise conscious awareness about public ownership, making all the arguments and more that I just made. That organizer will be equipped with PowerPoint presentations, with leaflets targeting each demographic as to why rural America, why underserved communities, why the tribes, why environmentalists and railroad workers and passengers and others should all be in support of public ownership of the railroad. So we have high hopes. This is a daunting task. For those of you who are in support of Medicare for all, i.e. single payer, you know that they have beaten the bushes for decades now. And at times we seem no closer to achieving Medicare for all than we did 50 years ago. But there really is no alternative. We believe, you know, we're gonna sink or swim, and we're gonna sink under private ownership of the means of production when it comes to things like railroads and energy and so forth, because these are our lifeblood, and this is what makes the economy run. And if we leave transportation, if we leave energy and things that are so important to the nation as a whole, the nation's economy, its well-being, its environmental health, to Wall Street, we're doomed. And I say that because I believe the evidence shows that that's the case. The rail industry is moribund. It's not expanding. The rail industry has made it clear it does not want to expand. It has turned away freight. It's a bulwark against the expansion of passenger rail. It has compromised on safety. It alone is responsible for the disaster at East Palestine, which, by the way, could have been way, way, way worse had the wreck been a quarter mile farther to the west and happened in downtown East Palestine. It could have devastated the entire downtown and killed dozens. And so for so many reasons, the private railroad system in the country has proven itself unworthy of the job and incapable of living up to the important task of moving forward into the future. I think I'll just end it right there. We only got a few more minutes, and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Ron,
Mm-hmm.
can you hear me, Ron? No.
Yes.
Oh, okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, people here with us in the audience and people on Zoom can pose questions to you. Okay?
Wonderful.
All right. So it's now here Eastern time. It's 5 to 11 and we'll resume. Let's make it 15. We'll resume at 10 minutes after 11. 10 minutes, we'll take a 15-minute break. How's that? Okay, and so we'll resume at 10 minutes after 11 Eastern time. Okay?
Sounds good. Thank you, Carol. Looking forward to it.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'll put on the view.
What the battery died.
We'll go to view. So other people. Use gallery.
No, this is because you show no video on a select.
Oh, that's it. Okay. All right.
The battery died on this one.
Oh, I have batteries in my bed.
Taking out this one.
We're gonna, no, I don't hear.
I turn it off.
We're gonna,
Couple seconds. It's on.
for those by Zoom, we're gonna have a 15-minute break and come back and take your questions and questions from people in the audience. So we need to put their pictures on. Okay. How do we get their pictures?
The video, even the guy who talked, he disabled the video.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, if you want a snack, it's on the table, and I'll go through my coat.
It'll be interesting. Yeah, I would think. I've always been the rail center. I can see where the bigger get this people are getting talk to the Chicago, well received. Yes, very well.
It's really good. And I looked at the topic and the content.
Yeah.
So then I was sick, but I came because.
Likewise, it's wonderful. We have, I mean, I never looked at it. It's just based on research.
Oh, you found it.
That's research. Because in that time, 41.
Well, I just got it.
Yeah, right, okay. But a little early, we came up with ideas like we will. Very well received in Chicago. Lots of people lost their job. You get some talks in the city. Very well received. Right. He worked there for a while. Yeah, it's not. I said, it was operation. They're getting turned away. You're getting baby. Which makes no sense.
I went to see her. I took a train.
And that's a short.
Article, so I should. St. Louis, now I can come visit you, I take care. So I did. And the train was closed down, but because we had to stop when there was a freight train and wait.
Freight train, oh yeah, I didn't read it. Some of them. You would sit in like 2 hours. Here it's a 5 hour plus trip.
Yeah, it's about 300 miles. St. Louis.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So it should be a 4 hour.
Well, if it's a girl, as I say, it'd be 2.5 hours.
Oh, those are great.
Oh, they're
They're
wonderful.
fabulous.
Wow.
We've taken them.
Well, anyway.
I have a friend who used to live in North Nashville.
Oh, yes, that's an issue. I thought you were selfish.
I would, she would say, call me when she visited her daughter in Seattle, and say, I'm going to visit. Oh, yes. I have to change trains in Chicago, so you can come with me when you.
It'd be like a 4 hour. Wait, well.
Can I say, okay, and call me when you get to Indiana somewhere, and then I'll know when to get on. Yeah. But it never happened, because the train was always several hours. And by the time she got to Chicago, she had to immediately change trains. She had no time.
Yeah, no time.
It would happen on the way back. Call me when you get to Eastern Iowa, so I'll know when to get on the L.
The best laid plan. Yes.
Only one time.
You're up, right? The train is 15 minutes late. They'll come on the loudspeaker apologizing, right?
One time, we went from these, I'm going to Barcelona, we took the TGV. And we got all the way to London, and then there was this electrical storm.
It wasn't the train.
They had to stop. They got on the loudspeaker every 10 minutes. They, how sorry they were that the train was late. Then finally they backed up back into Kathy, and they got bottom lunches for everybody on the train, and they passed down a card telling how we could apply for refunds because the train was late.
Which was no fault of their own either. It was no, really was.
And it was like if you wrote, if the train was more than 45 minutes late on a flight, what percentage you want to get a refund. I never bothered. I mean, so so amazed.
She saved a little note.
I have an outlook. One I remember that I put that it's amazing. Online.
Board meetings,
Yeah, just a different attitude. We talked about this so totally different. Yeah, exactly.
But that's how it was. And it was, it was going along. 180 miles. That's not the weather, but they still wanted to talk to things.
I know,
my,
for a relatively.
my son, granddaughter.
Well, it ended up being a 3.5 hour delay.
But they're going to compensate.
But it wasn't there, and it wasn't even there. Well,
And then
No.
my, my other, my grandson. All right.
Don't get afraid.
24.
Yeah, I found that. So,
Yeah, two young kids.
and it's 7.
Yes.
Yeah. No, but I'll ask around if anyone has.
Yeah,
that
I would-
or are, you know,
Yeah.
you- and because maybe there are some right now, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So.
Last weekend in February.
And my
around 4 o'clock.
children are coming in the first week in March, so they're my grandchildren, so.
Yeah,
It's your break, July.
It's a great, right. I
And
think
you have your son coming.
they're coming from California. And
I'll let you know.
okay, thank you. Yeah. Like your place.
How long, 4 or 5 days?
Yeah, it's a long weekend, you know, like Monday or Friday through Monday or something. Thank you.
Okay. Good, yeah.
Try.
yeah, I did.
Sorry, we did one of it. So I know. Well, and she knows a lot of people. She called me back last night and she said to call me. Which is stretching your legs, is that why you stand? Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
So you get it.
So that means.
She
is getting cold again, the air came back on.
restored to normal. So it's like incredible. And the doctor said that because she was so young when this came on. It's for the younger ones are the most likely to respond.
I know, but you don't think it's my son, because I'm not really that.
Otherwise, it's like. Very good.
As long as they get pushed, it's not there because it was back.
But she was right, so that she didn't get kept back. And, she has a friend, she really wanted to work, so she got working now. The oldest one is senior in high school. I just even talked to my she's taking all the.
We're asking.
Kind of cookies did she make?
She makes everything.
Oh, fancy mistake.
So.
Yes, so I.
He knows.
Finally, that's what. She finally.
I know where that is. Yeah. Because I was working for. I've always seen that everybody's from CBP here.
Many, and you found out that this was again, like 2 months ago. Not very much about that too, which is not even one of the kids. That's just an excuse for me that it's come a long way.
Yeah, it's an organization.
Really nice. You could go over here and have a big white card, but you went between the 2 chairs and everybody trips on these chairs all the time. Very, very knowledgeable. Right.
Well on it, and it the whole thing gets long further out. I kind of.
That's where I get it.
This is Alice.
Yeah, yeah.
15 minutes are up now.
Yes, I'm going down.
No, I'm going.
There's some. Hey. Thank you for coming.
Warm there?
Yes, all right, question time.
Last time. Okay, so. His mother
Where is it? Where is it? You?
well.
Let me get some. Okay, could we, I need a volunteer who's willing to bring the mic around to people who ask questions. We have one, thank you. Thank you, Howard. All right, I'll hand this to you. Okay, welcome back. We're gonna take the questions first from the people in the room. And then if you have questions on Zoom, we're gonna ask you to please unmute yourself, which you need to do because we can't. And you can either do it by clicking on the bottom of your screen, which is the first icon, microphone. And if you're muted, it has a red line through it, and you just click on it. Or you can press the space bar, and that should, and hold it down while you speak, and you'll be unmuted. So you can pick the people. I do have I have a question. Do you have any relationship with the Department of Transportation in your work, or Pete Buttigieg? Do you think, you know, everybody has such hope for the sky? Is he up to the task? What's your opinion?
I am ready anytime.
Go ahead.
He didn't hear your question.
Did you hear it? Wait,
He said he's ready
he
anytime.
said he didn't hear.
Did
it.
you not hear the question, Ron?
Oh, he's not hearing us.
You're gonna be muted.
We're not muted.
My apologies. I was using earbuds and I was wondering why I can't hear anybody. So sorry
Okay,
about that.
all right. So my question is, what kind of relationship, if any, do you have with the Department of Transportation? In particular, is there hope for the roses with Pete Buttigieg, or does it just look good on TV? So we'd like to know what's really going on.
Well, I'm not sure if I can tell you what's really going on because there's so much that happens behind the scenes and so much smoke and mirrors when you get talking about the government. The DOT is a double-edged sword, like most government agencies, including the sub-branch of DOT, which is FRA, Federal Railroad Administration. So the FRA can do some good things. It can also do some bad things. Amit Bose is the administrator of FRA, and of course, Pete Buttigieg is the head of the DOT. I would say this, they are less hostile to organized labor than the previous administration. Elaine Chao and her compatriot at FRA was Ram Batory, who was a lifelong CEO of railroads, who came to the position strictly from a management perspective. But we've seen different administrators come and go with lukewarm support for things like passenger train expansion. This is probably the best support we've ever gotten for passenger train expansion, courtesy of so-called Amtrak Joe as president. So 66 billion has been allocated through the bill that passed through Congress to be designated through DOT/FRA, and that process is starting. And so that is endearing the administration to some railroad workers. Biden didn't do himself a lot of favors with his asking Congress to send us back to or keep us from striking. So it's a mixed bag in terms of how we feel about the administration, how we feel about the DOT. But I think it remains to be seen. The FRA did recently come out with a listing of all of the 69 odd projects that would be funded potentially by this money. And includes corridors all over the country, expansion of frequencies and addition of new routes. So things are looking up in that regard. As far as advocating for public ownership of the railroad, at this point, we have not even moved into a political situation. We do not have one sponsor in Congress. There is no legislation, and we've designed it this way. We do not want to go to our best friends in Congress at this point. We want to build a movement first amongst all these organizations to push for public ownership. And when we feel we have enough strength amongst rail unions, amongst organized labor in general, amongst the environmental movement, et cetera, at that point, we will be starting to look for sponsors and co-sponsors of public ownership legislation. But at this stage of the game, we have basically no relationship with DOT.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions here? Oh.
What about the rail unions? They had very conservative leadership, but under the pressure of the strike movement, there was some changes like in the BLT. Anyway, what's their attitude?
Yeah, I mean, we have a sometimes confusing and contradictory relationship with the unions, just like the ARU of Eugene Debs back in the 1890s had a very similar relationship. There is a lot of support amongst working railroaders for RWU. They don't necessarily join. We, of course, do not hold a contract, and we do not purport, quote unquote, to represent railroad workers. So we're not a union per se. Anytime I talk to overseas railroad workers and I attempt to explain this, they're like, as far as we're concerned, you're a union, because, obviously we organize amongst workers in a single industry. It sounds like a union, but under U.S. labor law, under the Railway Labor Act, we are not a union. So we're not in competition with these 12 unions, nor do we want to be. Our idea is to build solidarity and unity amongst the different crafts. And as I started the talk by saying, for too long, we've been played off against each other, and it's to our mutual detriment. So how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? We have an informal slogan, which is, just because we can't be one single union doesn't mean we can't act like a single union. So we advocate that all the unions stick together in bargaining. No more bargaining with these powerful Fortune 500 corporations alone. We take our friends with us. We bargain as a group. It's actually known as collective bargaining. When you have 12 different segments of your workforce all bargaining separately, you obviously have just degraded the amount of power that you could and should have. I want to just quickly expand on that. Some of you might be teachers, retired teachers. Well, I was at Labor Day a few years ago, and a friend of mine who has just retired as a teacher approached our booth, and we started talking about what may be the first strike in National Railroad strike in 30 years. And she couldn't understand the complexity of the situation. I said, it's absurd. As a teacher, imagine if, and she was a union steward, she was a rep. She said, I said, if you went to your union meeting, but it was only 6th grade teachers, the gym teachers are having their meeting next week because the gym teachers union meets separately, as does the music teachers, as does the grade school teachers, the high school teachers, the junior high school teachers. You get the idea. It would be absurd. We have a teachers union, and we don't have a teachers union on the railroad. We have 12 clubs. And as you can tell by my sarcastic, cynical outlook, I am. Eugene Debs roundly condemned the craft unionism. He didn't condemn the individuals. And he said, let us concede that these men are not corrupt and that they are honest, righteous individuals, but their flaw is that they do not understand the need for an industrial union. They are hopelessly conservative, stuck in the past, and believe that by only organizing amongst engineers, by only organizing amongst conductors, etc., will we achieve what we want to achieve. And I think history has shown that that's ridiculous. The CIO put the kibosh on that idea in the 1930s. We have an auto workers union, we have a steel workers union, we have a transit workers union, etc. And this makes a lot more sense if you're really serious about being a trade union, because the ultimate goal of a trade union is empowerment and building power vis-a-vis the employment. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's sort of our relationship with the unions. I will say one more thing about it. So RWU, like I was saying, believes all unions should stick together. We believe they should all amalgamate and have a railroaders union. They refuse out of self-interest. You have 12 competing bureaucracies, but that means 12 sets of bureaucrats who are vice presidents, secretary treasurers, executive board members, and so forth. If you amalgamate into one, a lot of those folks are going to have to go back working in the craft, and they don't necessarily want to. But so short of amalgamation, we say at bargaining, every union should stick together. It should be an ironclad agreement so that no union settles until all unions settle. This is basic trade unionism, so that if the carrier tries to play us off one against the other, we refuse. We say, all of us are going to settle for the contract, or none of us will, and we will go on strike. Unfortunately, that's not what happened at the end of summer in 2022. A number of unions immediately bolted and said, we're going to settle for the terms of the Presidential Emergency Board. Other unions said, we're going to wait a little while. Others said they wanted a little bit more. And so we all scattered, and it was a fiasco. Imagine if all the unions could have spoken in one voice at that time and said, this is unacceptable. we want sick time, all of us now, things probably would have turned out better in bargaining. So that's kind of where we're coming from vis-a-vis the unions.
Just to follow up. What about nationalization of the railroads? Is there any unions that support that, or is it still to be won?
Yeah, a very good question. Unfortunately, none of the unions, and nor did we expect that they would, none of the rail unions have come out in support of public ownership of the railroad. The Plum Plan that I was talking about earlier, I would bet that almost no railroad workers nor railroad union officials have ever heard of it or know anything about it. And the reason I say that is because I'm a fairly knowledgeable guy. I'm 64. I've been in the labor movement my whole life. I came out of a social democratic, if you will, Walter Reuther. My dad said, if Walter Reuther's for it, I'm for it. He said, if the auto workers are for it, I'm for it. I came out of that kind of background, and et cetera, et cetera. I've been active in Railroad Workers United for going on 20 years. And I didn't know much about the Plum Plan or public ownership back during World War I. And so it's unlikely that too many people do. And so our job is to educate and obviously agitate as well, and painfully explain to our coworkers that railroad workers once were unanimous largely in their support for public ownership. Railroad workers all over the world are opposing privatization right now in places like France and Germany, Japan, and elsewhere. So I could go on and on about how public ownership is something that is legitimate, something that is the world over in rail. And of course, public ownership of the rest of the transportation industry in this country is the order of the day. The waterways, the airports, the seaports, the highways, all publicly owned. So, to tell our coworkers, before you get upset and think this is communism, or before you get upset and think the government can't do anything right, or before you say, no, 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 the free enterprise system is the only way forward in transportation, here's the facts. Here is the history. And basically let them decide for themselves. And we believe that railroad workers, at least the majority, will come down on the side of public ownership. It's not a panacea, but many of the issues that confront us can be solved by public ownership. And so that's kind of the long-term approach, strategic approach that we're going to take. And when railroad workers get on board, just like you noted, the leadership is then pressured to do the right thing. They may be coming along kicking and screaming. I believe that was probably the case 100 years ago, because the brotherhoods have been very, very conservative throughout their existence. But despite their conservativeness, in 1919, 1920, they actually were all lock, stock, and barrel in support of public ownership. So I believe we can move to that position once again.
I have a question, So, like I think a lot of us in the room, this is really quite fascinating, and probably many of us weren't aware of all this, especially the potential strike in 2022. I guess my point is, you made so many wonderful points. But there is almost no information in the media. Now, granted, the media is also very corporate-owned, but has anyone, beside the rail workers themselves, this is such a small minority of our population, if you've got at least some percentage of people that sort of start saying, wow, this is really important, we should be supportive. Maybe if you had some connection to segment on PBS or the newspapers that very few people read anymore, but I think that could spark some more interest and help to move this forward. So what's your
Comment about that, please.
Thanks for the question. I'll start by saying, to our delight, in August of 2022, actually starting before that, small, independent, left of center media outlets like The Real News out of Baltimore, More Perfect Union, and I don't know if any of these ring a bell, but limited audience, but sort of really well done news, started to contact us about the draconian attendance policies on the railroad, the potential for a strike at both BNSF and at Norfolk Southern. And then, of course, the floodgates opened when unions started to vote down, the rank and file started to vote down the tentative agreements. And Railroad Workers United came out for a vote no. We encouraged all of our co-workers in all 12 unions to vote no. And we succeeded because the majority represented, okay, so 8 unions voted in favor, but 4 unions opposed it. And those 4 unions represented a majority of the railroad workforce. And that's what brought it all to a head there in late November, early December. So the news was all over us, and we developed a media outreach committee of 15, both working and retired railroaders. I was still working at that time, of course. It was, I think, 11 of us working, 4 of us were retired, and we were answering up to a dozen media requests every day. It was phenomenal. And so we broke into some bigger outlets. Daniel's Wordling, who used to be on NPR for years, now he does a show with another reporter called Two Reporters. Wordling has done interviews with us. The TV station in New York City that's fronted by the City University, Democracy Now!, had both myself and one of our co-chairs, who's an engineer on Union Pacific, Ross Gruters, 2 different times. Amy Goodman interviewed us. And then we had people like Lauren Gurley, who's a reporter for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And so it was our big moment. It was absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, the unions largely shut up. They generally are very shy of talking to the media. In retrospect, I think they realized it was a huge mistake. So that's our job, is, we're the tail that wags the dog. We shame, coax, cajole, and otherwise force the union leadership to do what they should have been doing all along. But of course, remember, they wanted us to vote yes and put this all behind us and not make a big fuss. And so they weren't really in a position to talk to the press. It was phenomenal how vacant and missing in action the union leadership was. Fast forward a few months, the train derails at East Palestine, and lo and behold, once again, we're getting a dozen requests from the mainstream media for comment. And somewhere in there, the unions finally decided they were going to speak, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, the media has no longer paid attention. There's bigger fish to fry. There's other struggles and battles and fights and politics to move on to. And so we're back in the closet again. Nobody's really thinking about rail until perhaps the next catastrophic derailment or the next big contract fight, which, by the way, will be starting November 1st of this fall. It might take years and years under the drawn out process of the Railway Labor Act, but that fight actually starts. Contracts in rail don't expire, but they go in perpetuity, but they're subject to amendment, which is to say negotiation, every so often. And so that bargaining process will actually start in another 8 months, 9 months. And maybe we'll get back in the spotlight again. In the meantime, we do what we can. We issue press releases about our fights, our struggles, our perspectives. But right now, I would say between the presidential race, politics in general, Gaza, Ukraine, you get the idea. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of focus on railroads and railroad workers. But we'll do our best as much as possible to get the press looking at our issues whenever we can.
Okay. Any other questions?
Any other question?
Okay. Is there anyone on Zoom who would like to ask a question? Please unmute yourself.
There is a question about Lac-Megantic. If the person, I think it's Barbara Drake, if she wants to ask it. Otherwise, I'll read it.
I can ask it. So I don't know if everyone here is familiar with what happened in Lake Megantic or Lac Megantic in a number of years ago in Quebec. Anyway, there was evidently only one person in charge of running the train, and it was a number of oil tankers. Anyway, the brakes failed, or the brakes were not set correctly. I don't know. And the train ran into the town, and something over 40 people died. It pretty much set the whole town on fire, and the rest of the buildings all had to be taken down because of petroleum pollution. But I was asking whether this is one of those cases where downsizing employees was really at fault, not the train.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the whole Lac-Megantic debacle preoccupied this organization for a few years. And primarily, not just because it was such a dramatic and tragic and unnecessary train wreck, but because, exactly as you're speculating, it was the direct result of cuts to safety, cuts to personnel, cuts to inspection, and cuts to maintenance. And I'll get into that in just a bit. The other reason that RWU got so involved in the Lac-Megantic case, and this didn't actually happen until, if I got my years right, 2015. So the wreck took place in July of 2013. It was the 10-year anniversary last year, and we participated together with the citizens of Lac-Megantic in commemorative exercises in the town of Lac-Megantic. But it wasn't until 2015, in the middle of the night, that a Canadian SWAT-style team invaded the house of the engineer of that train and the train director, in this country known as the train dispatcher. In the middle of the night, they were abducted at gunpoint, high-powered rifles, and taken to jail. Eventually, of course, they were out on bail, and they were put on trial for murder. And it was obscene. And the citizens of Lac-Megantic, potentially with our encouragement and support, came to the realization and understanding that it is not individuals' faults when there are such disasters. And it specifically was not the fault of Tom Harding and Richard Labrie, the train director. It was the fault of the railroad. It was the fault of the lack of regulation by the Transportation Board, space in the name. In Canada, they have very similar agencies as us, and they're even similarly named. I think it's Transport Canada, which refused to regulate the industry, including things like proper securement of unattended trains. We have better rules, ironically, in the United States than they do in Canada. So we made the case that there were so many factors that led to this tragedy beyond the case that the engineer, Tom Harding, Tom didn't set enough handbrakes, and that's why the train rolled away. So the rail industry is real fond of this thing called behavior-based safety. Now, what the hell is behavior-based safety? All right, it's ideologically loaded. And behavior-based safety basically says, if you get hurt, if you get injured, if there are any accidents or mishaps, it's your fault. It's not the industry's fault. We've trained you, we've qualified you, we've given you the books, the tools, the personal protective equipment. So if anything goes wrong, it's not our fault, it's your fault. And that's what they tried to do with Lac-Megantic. This had nothing to do with the management of that railroad. So our job to save Richard Labrie, Richard Labrie and Tom Harding. And we were in touch with his lawyer and so forth and so on. We promoted numerous articles about what really happened that day. So the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic was what was called a short line railroad. It used to be a main line of the Canadian Pacific. Like many of the big Class 1 railroads, when I was talking earlier about this operating ratio, the big Class 1s don't really have an interest anymore in a lot of short lines or secondary main lines and so forth. And so they spin them off. They spin them off to generally non-union, low-wage railroads of a few hundred miles, perhaps. And that was the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic. Ed Burkhart, who was a bit of a renegade in the rail industry, attempted to run trains with a single person 30 years ago in the state of Wisconsin. At that time, the state of Wisconsin passed a law that said, no, every train in our state has to have an engineer and a conductor. Burkhart has gone on to be on the boards of directors and the CEO of numerous short line and regional railroads. He's extremely anti-union, he's anti-worker, he's anti-labor, and we would maintain he's anti-safety. So the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic had a horrible safety record by the metrics, objectively horrible safety record. CEO Burkhart managed to reach agreement with the union, to its everlasting discredit, to run trains on the MMNA with one person. 2 months later, the train rolled away at Lac-Mégantic. Now, how did the single person figure in all this? People will say, Tom Harding was asleep in bed in a hotel. It wouldn't have mattered if there was a 2-person crew or a 5-person crew. They all would have been in bed, asleep in the hotel. How could it be the fault of single-person crews? And there are lots and lots of reasons. They parked that train on a steep slope, what they call steep slopes in Canada. We call them grades. The train was parked on one of the steepest grades in Eastern Canada with no derail protection. The automatic air brake that Westinghouse invented 140 odd years ago was not to be used. In the United States, union, carrier, federal regulation all mandate that if you leave a train unattended, you are to set a full service brake application on the train and the locomotives. In Canada, there's no such regulation. And the MMNA instructed their engineers to not set the automatic brake because, this is hard to believe, but you can get sticking brakes in cold weather and you go to release the brakes and you really need a 2-person crew to ensure that the brakes release, and you don't want stuck brakes. So don't set the automatic. It was incredulous. None of us could believe that this was really the ultimate cause of that train wreck. If the automatic brake had been set, this wouldn't have happened. They had an alternative to park this train on level ground 1 mile to the west, so it would not have rolled away. The railroad didn't park the train there. Why? Because to do so, they would have had to cut the crossing. It's a term that the railroad train and engine crews use. There's a crossing of motorist traffic, and so you had to separate the train into 2 pieces for it to be there. And as a result, they would have to put the train back together in the morning. And it's really hard to separate and put a train back together with 1 person. You kind of need 2. So there's multiple reasons why a 2-person crew would have kept that train from running away. On the regulatory front, as I said, if they had set the automatic brake, or if it was law that you had to, like it is in the United States, the train wouldn't have run away. The locomotive had a fire in the middle of the night. It was poorly maintained. It had been written up by train crews for weeks. They didn't have the money, didn't want to allocate the money to fix that locomotive. There's a maintenance problem. Obviously, they were skimping on maintenance. In addition, that train, when it caught fire, the fire department showed up there's an emergency shutdown switch on all diesel locomotives. The fire department, doing quite what they should do, shut it down by pushing the button and cut off the fuel to the diesel locomotive, and it helped assist in putting out the fire. When you shut a diesel locomotive down, it will trip a breaker that has to do with the air brake system. And in doing so, the automatic brake should automatically go on, and every car in that train should have automatically had a full service brake application when that firefighter pushed the button to shut off the fuel to the locomotive. It didn't. The engine had been jury rigged, and all of this is in the proceedings, and it all came out at the trial. So I would maintain that while the engineer may have not set enough handbrakes, A, there was no stipulation of the number of brakes that the engineer must set. B, the locomotive had been jury rigged. C, it was a terrible locomotive that was in desperate need of repair, hence the fire, but nothing was done about it. Where am I up to? D, if it had been a two-person crew, as I just explained, the train never would have run away. So we helped the defense make the case that in fact, you have 17 reasons why the company was at fault, and you only have one reason while the engineer, and for crazy to me that the train director was even implicated in this. He was in Montreal or someplace. Anyway, those individuals were found innocent. They were put on trial once again. I think they may have suffered a $500 fine or something, but at the end of the day, they were set free, and they're free men today. And that's a long explanation of Lac-Mégantic. There's a lot to this wreck. And for us, it was a cause célèbre, and we attempted to publicize it in the United States, where it didn't get a lot of airplay, because if you remember, after Lac-Mégantic, oil trains started to derail and blow up all over the country, including Castleman, North Dakota, along the James River in Virginia. There was another in West Virginia, one in the Dalles along the Columbia River in Oregon. And the oil that was coming out of the Bakken oil out of North Dakota and eastern Montana was extremely flammable. One other reason the industry was to blame, because they knew it was highly flammable oil, which is very different than most crude oil. It had all of these gases in it that were capable of exploding. And so everybody was flummoxed about the Lac-Mégantic explosion. How could this happen? Crude oil doesn't explode like this. Well, Bakken crude does, and it did, and it continued to, because the industry didn't want to separate out the volatile gases, because that would add to the expense of the Bakken. And so they shipped it with all the volatile gases intact. And so we had at least a dozen of these so-called bomb trains, which were derailing and exploding all over the country. Once again, I rest my case. The industry is not suitable to move the nation's freight safely. Exhibit B.
Thank you very much for this. I appreciate it. As I said in a private message to you, my family lived in Lac-Mégantic for about 10 years, long before that accident, but it absolutely affected all of us. And I had no idea that you'd put so much time and effort into it, because you're right, it wasn't publicized. And this is the kind of thing that we should see on the news instead of somebody's dog running away.
I couldn't agree more. We were baffled by the lack of publicity south of the border. 5 years later, 3 railroaders, an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee, all met their deaths at a runaway grain train in British Columbia. Underpowered, 20 below zero, brakes not working properly, extremely steep grade through the Rockies. Train ran away, and all 3 of them were killed. Same thing, lack of regulation by Transport Canada, and complete and total incompetence, negligence, lack of maintenance, and all the rest on the part of Canadian Pacific. And so, you know, every 5 years or so, it seems like we're getting one of these. We do have them in the United States as well. These that were in Canada were two very, very dramatic examples in recent years of tragic runaway trains. But it's amazing, the news blackout. If it happens in Canada, you just don't hear about it at all. It's bad enough if it happened in Wyoming or Idaho or Appalachia, but we wouldn't hear too much about it. But if it happens in Canada, I'm amazed at how many railroaders had never heard about the Lac-Mégantic train wreck when we started publicizing it in 2014. But yeah, there you have it.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
For sure, for sure. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from people on Zoom? Okay, well, we want to thank you, everybody here.
Thanks, everybody. I did drop a few more links in the chat. If you want to view our entire website and get a better idea of what Railroad Workers United is all about, what we stand for, there's a link, railroadworkersunited.org. I highly suggest you look at the link. The drop-down menu says campaigns. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we're going to completely redo and modernize our website, hopefully to be done in the next week or two. So it'll be much more user-friendly and pleasant to look at and navigate. But for now, if you go to the campaigns, you'll see 10 different campaigns. I did put the link to the Lac-Mégantic campaign, and it talks all about Tom Harding and Richard Labrie and the debacle that they went through and RW's role in helping to defend them. And then last but not least, there's links if you want to donate to the organization. I was told by our grant writer I need to do this. And then also we do have solidarity memberships for people outside of the rail industry. Usually it's people like truck drivers, longshoremen, and others in sort of auxiliary industries who want to express their solidarity and play a role in the organization. But anybody's welcome to join RW as a solidarity member. You just don't get a vote because you're not in the rail industry, and you cannot sit on the steering committee or any other officiating body of the organization. But anybody's welcome to join if you're interested. And Richard and Carol, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome, thank you. And we're going to put up a link on our website for this lecture to be on Zoom on YouTube, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, in fact, I'd love to watch it and mostly to share it with other railroad workers. We'll put it up on our website and we'll blast it out to our email list of over 4,000 people. So hopefully it'll get a lot of views.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.